From the Egyptian creation myths housed on the walls of pyramids to the epic tales of Greek heroes, our world is rich with myths and legends. But how come these stories, despite originating from vastly distinct cultures, share so many commonalities? Today we delve into a fascinating question that has puzzled historians for centuries. Are the shared themes and archetypes and myths from across the world a result of cultural diffusion, or do they stem from psychology, the expression of the universal human experience? Cultural diffusion refers to the spread of cultural beliefs and social activities from one group to another. Ancient trade routes, conquests, and migrations were highways for the exchange of stories and ideas. Myth, even when spoken under the confines of language, carried with it the distinct culture and values of the speaker. These stories and beliefs spread like the longest game of telephone, and these stories morphed over time, guided by language barriers and perhaps that one father who wanted to frighten his child a bit more with some hyperbolized version of what he had heard. But where exactly did this game of telephone start? Well, many hypothesize a theoretical Proto-Indo-European myth, stories that were exchanged by prehistoric people who spoke the Proto-Indo-European language around 4,500 years ago. The branches that descend from the Indo-European family include European languages, many Indic and Iranian languages, and more. Like language, it is believed that the myths of those in the Indo-European family derive from the Proto-Indo-European root. We actually don't even have any written records to prove the existence of the Proto-Indo-European myth, but what we can do is reconstruct it through comparative mythology, comparing the ideas common among the descendants. These shared ideas include the pantheon of gods and similarities in mythical creatures, monsters, heroes, epics, rituals, moral themes, and more. For instance, both the Iliad, an ancient Greek epic from Homer, and the Mahabharata, an ancient Indian epic, share striking resemblances. Both center themselves around a pivotal war, include significant divine intervention, Athena, Zeus, Apollo in one, and Krishna and Indra in the other, share themes of duty and the horrors of war, and have a very similar narrative style. Of course, their largest differences reflect the distinctions between ancient Greek and Hindu philosophy and culture. Another example of this is between the Odyssey, also from Homer, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, originating in ancient Mesopotamia, meaning it would not have been a descendant of Proto-Indo-European myth like the rest. In particular, they are both powerful examples of the hero's journey, of which both include encounters with monsters and gods, and themes of xenia, or hospitality, are explored in both. These connections seem to detract from the theory of Proto-Indo-European myth, considering the Epic of Gilgamesh is not one of its direct successors, but perhaps, rather, there is simply something more going on. For instance, it is certainly not unlikely that these parallels arose from cross-cultural interaction as societies traded with and conquered one another. But perhaps also cultural interaction may not be the only agent breeding these correspondences, that instead these commonalities are fundamentally essential to the human condition. This leads us into the second focus of this video essay, human psychology and universality. Carl Jung, one of the pioneers of psychology during the 20th century, proposed the idea of a collective unconscious, which is driven by ancestral memory, the inherent psychological passing down of characteristics from ancestors. This shared psychological framework leads to his definitions of archetypes, universal themes and symbols that all humans develop concepts of individually, linked by the flowing movement of ancestral memory. The theory of a collective unconscious has its skeptics, however, since it lacks empirical evidence. The only evidence even really being the affinities and myths across cultures, which is a clear case of circular reasoning. A more easy to align with belief is the concept of a universal human experience, that we all have a similar psychological basis and lens of the world because we all have the same life experiences, like birth, struggle, and death, as well as natural experiences, like the changing seasons or natural disasters. The next popular figure in this vein of theories is Joseph Campbell of the mid-20th century, who was heavily influenced by Carl Jung's exploration of archetypes. He more formally defined the shared narrative in myth through the hero's journey, which he calls the monomyth, a template that many stories appear to abide by. All heroes' journeys in myth include a departure, with a call to adventure, an initiation, where the hero is faced with challenges, and a return, where the hero gets to come home with some sort of reward, including the heightened experience brought by the journey. It's particularly interesting that distinct cultures have roughly followed the same template for forever, and Campbell's argument for this phenomenon is most aligned with Carl Jung's collective unconscious and the concept of a universal human experience. Whether these connections come from human interaction, human psychology, coincidence, or even a combination of them, perhaps an important takeaway is that humans are much more connected than we think. Before the internet and other methods that have enabled more efficient international social interaction ever existed, global trends in culture and myth were still somehow always there, despite anyone really even knowing. In a society plagued by a long history of war and conflict driven by our perceived differences, humans have always been much more alike than we think.